Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host,
Hello,
Rachel
everyone.
Bernstein.
Welcome to our episode today, where it is part one of my conversation with Jon Atack. Yet another opportunity to have a great conversation together. Jon Atack is a leading expert on authoritarian cult groups, as well as a best-selling author, and he's worked with hundreds of former members and has lectured and written extensively in a career spanning 4 decades. Jon wrote Scientology, the Cult of Greed, as a simple introduction to the subject, and his influential book, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, is the only comprehensive history of this bizarre group. Through his popular YouTube channel and podcast, he endeavors to make complex psychological ideas accessible. His scholarship has been supported by many academics from varying fields of study. Jon's book, Opening Our Minds, shows how cultic behaviors are established throughout society, and it sheds light on the methods used in pseudo-religions, therapy, and commercial cults, even terrorism, gangs, grooming, hazing, and modern slavery. He also shows that these methods succeed because of failures in our educational systems. Here's Jon Atack now. My pleasure to be speaking to Jon Atack again on this show. We have set aside time to be able to speak and also hopefully speak more often at a regular clip where you get to hear more of our discussions and also more about what Jon is studying, which is usually many things all at once, which is quite incredible. Don't know how you do it. So welcome to the show, Jon.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and it's my honor and my pleasure to be with you. There's Stephen Laycock, the humorist, brilliant American humorist, had this phrase: "He rode off in all directions," and that's what's happening in my mind all the time, as you say. I started working on a book in August, and I thought this would take me 3 weeks, and here we are. And it started out as a book about beliefs, that just a simple premise that if you believe absurdities, then it's quite likely that awful things will happen.
Yeah.
Something like this is attributed to Voltaire, but he never actually said it. He did make this great long pronouncement, was in French though, so I don't understand a word of it. But the second premier of India, Radhakrishnan, did say, if you believe absurdities, you may commit atrocities or something like that. But he probably said it in Hindi, so I wouldn't understand that either. And I started with that idea, and it all, 3 years ago, Steve Hassan and I were going to write this book about belief. And I spent 3 months writing a proposal, finding the craziest ideas from all over the place. Not the kind of routine stuff that we hear over and over again, you know. So, do you know about the cream cheese apostle?
No, it's not like a Jewish deli thing. No,
he could have done that.
He could, yeah.
He was
I
actually
would respect that. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and you would. He was incredibly popular in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. And so much so, in fact, that there was a district of Berlin called Peace Town that he was in charge of. And he'd served in the First World War, and he used to have huge meetings. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people followed the cream cheese apostle. And then one night he was arrested because they'd found, the police had been told, and they'd come along, and they found this corpse slathered, and slathered is the only word for it, in cream cheese. Now, if you do want to try this, if you've got a corpse at home and you want to try this, make sure you have some salt in the cream cheese, because it doesn't work otherwise, apparently.
Okay, so, everyone, please take a note, because I'm sure that's about to happen. Yes, in real life.
I think we should also say at this point, please don't try this at home.
Exactly.
So he was arrested, and they took him to court, and then he went, oh, it's not actually a crime to slather cream cheese over corpses, darn. But by this time, they'd also had a complaint about a baby that had gone blind because it had cream cheese put in its eyes. Or she had had cream cheese put in her eyes. But her parents wouldn't make a complaint against him because he was their guru. And he'd have meetings where the ghost of Bismarck, the famous German politician, would come and shout at the crowd and people would go into hypnotic trances and all of this. So isn't it a shame that this is lost to history, that this man who was so influential? And just the sting in the tail is this. His peace town became the headquarters of the Gestapo during World War II, in the lead up to World War II. And I think it was the 1970s when his followers, yes, he still had people who rubbed cream cheese all over themselves. It could be fun. I don't know. I'm not going to try it. But all of these people, they sued and they got Peacetown back. And you can go on the internet, and I'm not going to talk about any of the other weird things I found because I want to keep them secret. But they still exist. About 400 people in Peacetown who can tell you the virtues of cream cheese, slightly salted. So I started with lots of stories like that. I wrote this proposal and sent it to Steve's agent, who pointedly ignored it.
Okay.
And he told me, I want a book called Extraordinary Popular Delusions, this guy. And so where's it gone? I reached down, it's down here somewhere. It's a book published in the 1840s by a guy called Charles Mackay. Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And it's a brilliant book. It's about 800 pages long, but well worth the trouble, you know. It's got things like the tulip mania in, which is actually a bit of a made-up story, but we won't go there. So I wrote in this proposal and he ignored it. And I went off and did something else. Last August, I thought, I need to write another book. So I pulled out this proposal and wiped the bitterness off it, you know, and started writing. And then this thought, you know, I'm kind of, the one thing I hadn't included in this book was Scientology. And, you know, people who know me, sadly, tend to know me because of Scientology. I have also published on terrorism and done lots of other work on other groups. And, of course, on authoritarianism in general. But I am known for writing about Scientology, and that's what will be on my tombstone, sadly. He wrote about Scientology, it will say. Poor fool. So I thought I've got to include Scientology, and pretty soon, as it tends to do, Scientology took over. So I thought, all right, let's write a book called If Scientology Ruled the World. Let's have a thought experiment. Let's go. David Miscavige is now the world leader, and we're going to apply Scientology's policies to the world. And so I started writing that. And it starts with the I don't know if you know this, but the last word of Lafayette Ronald Hubbard was released in 1988. So he very carefully died so that nobody could he wouldn't get into any trouble about it. And then on the very pinnacle of Scientology, and it remains the highest level in Scientology, operating Satan level 8, we got this amazing bulletin, only shown to the few tens of people who'd made the cut and paid the $250,000 or what have you to get onto this course. And it could only be done on Free Winds, their cruise ship that comes out of the Netherlands Antilles, all very weird. And you had to strap it to your arm and be under video cameras and all of this. And for 1 week, this bulletin existed. It was in the public view. Well, it was in the view of those people who paid that much money and were that dedicated and had clean ethics records, which meant they'd never had an unpleasant thought about Ron Hubbard. Or Scientology, of course. So, unfortunately for Scientology, a couple of people who saw this left. And despite all of the security to prevent them from doing so, they managed to copy it. And it became public. It's a bulletin written on the 5th of May, 1980, in which L. Ron Hubbard says that his purpose, the entire purpose of Scientology, is to prevent the second coming of Christ.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Now, curiously, this was actually leaked out before it was released on OT8, and I saw it in 1988, and I didn't believe it.
Right.
I know he was crazy, but surely saying that he was, and he says directly that he's with the Antichrist and Lucifer, they are named as his buddies, and that he's going to come back as a political leader. Now, he's had, 38 years now, 39 actually, last month since he died, and he doesn't seem to have come back, unless, of course, he's inhabited the body of another existing political leader. Put your speculations in the comments below. What politician reminds you of Ron Hubbard?
Right.
But he said that his whole purpose, the whole purpose of Scientology, is to do this. And I saw this before the people on the Free Winds saw it, and I went, no, this can't be true. This is insane. Then two people smuggled it out, and they said, this is what we saw. And I'm still going, can this be? And then I talked with Jesse Prince. Now, Jesse Prince was in charge of all of Scientology's technology at this time. And he said, he said, when David Miscavige issued the course, he wouldn't even show it to me. So it was given to people without him seeing it, but he saw it afterwards. And it was like, yep, this is Hubbard. And what he says is that the second coming, which we've got to stop, is actually the invasion of the Markabians.
Invasion of the Markabians?
Invasion of the Markabians. Now, so as I was working on this, I kind of went, okay, and I dug through, nowadays you can search all of the millions of words that Ron Hubbard left. So, the old days, you used to have to actually read them. I did far too much of that, and that's probably why I am the way I am today. So I searched for Markabians, and I found these, I think 4 references in the late 50s, early 60s. And it's a joke. Okay. It's like, it's this the Markab system, these other people, and it's why we're terrified of income tax, and we're a prison planet for Markab, or some nonsense like this. But there's nothing serious. But when I left Scientology in 1983, my path very quickly crossed with Captain Bill Robertson. Now, Captain Bill was a real captain. He had ship's papers as a captain. He was the captain of Ron Hubbard's Apollo. He was a civil engineer by trade, ripped out the foundations of St. Hill Castle, so-called castle, and put in proper ones, leaving so they could build the peculiar thing that they've got there at the moment, which we won't worry about at this moment. He was 6'4". He was big and burly and hairy. He had a Harley Davidson. And he told me that he was the second deputy commodore of Scientology. So Hubbard was the commodore, a term which I think he may have got from Cornelius Vanderbilt. I only found this out recently, the tyrant of the Gilded Age, or one of them, who called himself the Commodore. So it may not simply be, a naval rank that he'd appropriated. He was a lieutenant in the Navy, which is somewhat lower than a Commodore. But he was a Commodore. Mary Sue Hubbard, who, of course, unfortunately went to prison for false imprisonment, kidnapping, breaking and entering, burglary, bugging, theft of government documents, a forgery of government credentials. She was the deputy Commodore, and Captain Bill was the second deputy Commodore. And then he was thrown out. And he became really quite famous. We have this term, the free zone, among Scientologists. That was Captain Bill. He invented the free zone. And I hosted a meeting at the Crown Hotel in East Grinstead on the 18th of October 1983. You can find little snippets of the video I had made of that on the internet, where Bill shouts at us, and I have been with Ron for many centuries, and all. It's great, good fun. And a friend of mine who was in the front row said she had a headache for a week after the shouting. But he was an astonishing and eccentric character, and he handed over these things which he called sector operations bulletins. And they were very popular briefly among Scientologists. And they claimed to be messages telepathically received from L. Ron L. Ray on the mothership. So L. Ron L. Ray was L. Ron Hubbard. He explained that to me. He had left the body. This was in 1982, 4 years before he did actually officially leave the body. But, there were people around him who said he wasn't very often at home in the 1980s, a little bit demented. So maybe part of him was on the mothership. And Captain Bell had transcribed these things, which were about the Markabian takeover of the planet Earth. So I was exposed to all of that stuff, when I left Scientology at the very young age of 28. And for about 12 days, I believed it because I'd been in Scientology. And then I went, this is absolutely nuts. So when it came back round that here we are, that this claim by Hubbard that we've got to stop the Markabians, I wrote to Janice Gillam Grady, who's an excellent person. She, from the age of 12, was one of the original 3 Commodore's messengers. She was with Hubbard almost daily for 11 years. So from the age of 12, didn't get an education or any that kind of thing, those poor people. So, this is psychological abuse of children that Hubbard was practicing aboard his ship. But Janice managed to escape, managed to decide that she doesn't believe in Scientology anymore, despite having spent so much time with the Commodore. But I wrote to her and said, well, you were with Ron in 1979, and Captain Bill was last with Ron in 1979. Was he talking about Markabians? This thing was meant to be written in May 1980. And she said, yes. He was terrified that the Markabians were on their way back. So that got me started. Don't get me started.
My goodness.
Sonny Boy Williamson, don't start me talking, I'll tell everything I know. And I kind of went, okay, so let's start with Ron Hubbard and the occult. Let's start with all of that. I've done more work on that than anyone else, the connection to Crowley. And in this 1980 thing, there's this little line where he says that this first came to his attention in 1945. I'm going, this really is genuine. That's the year he met Jack Parsons. Oh, no.
Right.
And in 1946, and from January to March, they perform a series of rituals, which included a certain amount of masturbation, but we won't get into that. It's magic, it's magic.
And sex magic.
We won't tell you what the wand means because you can probably work it out by now. So they perform these very serious rituals, which are recorded as the Book of Babylon, which some people say doesn't exist. I've got 3 different copies of it. They look real enough to me because Parsons actually recorded the ceremonies and then transcribed them. And what they're trying to do is bring the Age of Babylon, the Whore of Babylon, the Scarlet Woman, the Book of Revelation, who is the agent of the Antichrist who will unleash Armageddon on the world. There is the beginning of Scientology. Hubbard's attempt to start Armageddon and overthrow the Christian religion. And here he is in 1980, near the end, saying the purpose of Scientology is exactly what he started then, to bring about the age of the Antichrist and the reign of Lucifer and the Whore of Babylon. So I wrote a lot about that. I wrote 4 chapters about that and thought, well, that's enough of that. And then I thought I better describe Scientology. So I did that. Then I thought, so what's relevant about this? If Scientology ruled the world, what's the proper comparison to Scientology? Because Scientology is anti-democratic. Although there are lots of women in power in Scientology who've had powerful positions, Hubbard was outspokenly, in the book Science of Survival, he dismisses the idea of women ever having managerial positions. The woman's face is barefoot and in the kitchen and pregnant, tied to the sink, fundamentally. So you have this right wing. He keeps going on about being Anglo-Saxon, just in case anybody hadn't noticed his feelings about other people.
Right.
If they took over, So I wanted to make a comparison, I'm going to admit it, with the Nazis, because I started studying the ideas of Nazi occultism as soon as I left Scientology. Because somebody came along with Powers and Bergier, The Morning of the Magicians, which is absolute nonsense. But it's an interesting thought. And then I read Ravenscroft, The Spear of Destiny, which is ludicrous. And then Suster's Hitler in the Age of Horus, which starts to be a little bit scholarly. And then Nicholas Goodrick Clark, Professor Nicholas Goodrick Clark, The Occult Roots of Nazism. Since then, I've read whatever else there is on this subject. And it's this thought of, well, I'm guessing that most people don't know that the Ordo Templi Orientis of Aleister Crowley was actually started by one of the men that gave Aryan race theory to the Nazis. It's a German organization, started in around 1900. And so there is a common origin for Scientology and Nazi Aryan race theory. We then get into the reality that quite a lot of the Nazi leaders, Rudolf Hess, the deputy leader of the party, Heinrich Himmler, the second most powerful man in the German Reich, the head of the Gestapo, the SS, the Waffen-SS, the military SS, the death camps, and Minister of the Interior. And Hans Frank, who would be the governor of Poland, where all of the significant, the larger death camps were. These guys were all deeply into occultism, Wotanism, and a variety of occult practices. This we now know. There's no doubt about it. However, that's not the whole story. There was also a massive Lutheran wing of the Nazi party. So it isn't a matter that the Nazis came out of this occult stuff, but it is fair to say that the Thule-Gesellschaft, or Thule Society, where the Nazi party was founded in 1919, believed these things, and they were combined in with this ludicrous nonsense about a pure blood Aryan race. So I wanted to write about that, and I wanted to write about eugenics, because it's a bloody stupid idea, and it needs to be as widely known as possible that our DNA is not distinct, that the differences in skin color, eye color, and hair color are significant differences between people. The rest is pretty much the same. And all of us have genes of all types overlapping from all places. There are no pure blood. But I kind of figure that most people don't know the origin of Aryan race theory. They think it's about being white. And then there's not being Jewish. That's part of it. Though, in fact, in the origins of Aryan race theory, the Jews were part of the Aryan people, but we weren't, that's a bit disturbing to neo-Nazis and the like. This pure blood of course, excludes Slavs. So anybody who's of Eastern European origin, these were the original enemies of the people who created Aryan race theory in Austria around about 1900. I wanted to look at that, and I'm kind of going, how are we going to do this? You're writing about Scientology here, and now you're going to say, let's talk about the Nazis. Why is this relevant? How does this fit together? And it fits together because if Scientology took the world over, then anybody who disagreed with Scientology would be a Markabian. And if you're a Markabian, you would need to be exterminated because you're not of the right spiritual type. And so I've been tying all of that together fundamentally. That was a long introduction, wasn't it? Don't start me talking. Right. Questions, please.
Yes. Okay. Number one. I think, first of all, when you talk about people like Janice, I remember I've met her a number of times. The first time I met her was at Spanky Taylor's house.
Yeah, Spanky. She's brilliant. I love Spanky.
Yeah. and Tori was there, and Janice, and they're all talking and going through stories. And I felt so honored to be there to hear just them talking about their history. And I remember years ago just speaking with Hannah Whitfield, and she would talk about the conversations she would have with L. Ron Hubbard as they were on the ship at night under the stars, and he would point to the different stars and speak the language of the people of that planet. And when you hear these sorts of stories, and I think Janice also talking about needing to hide the medicine bottles that L. Ron Hubbard had so that, he would be camera ready if there was anyone wanting to take a photo, and he had to hide that he was on things. And so he had the people close to him colluding with his mythology about not,
of course,
if you're in Scientology, you don't need any medication, you don't need any medical care, and it's medical care that he kept other people from getting, but made himself available to it, and made it certainly took care of whatever he needed for himself, which is a whole way to be raised up in a group, knowing that you're keeping the secrets of the people in charge, and that you have to somehow make sense of that in your own mind.
Yeah.
There's so many internal conflicts, I'm sure, ethically, and all of it, growing up in these kinds of situations. But when you hear about this idea that going along with this theme of if Scientology had taken over the world and the Markabians and people would need to be exterminated, it's chilling. It's chilling also to know that Scientology is still around, and most people in it don't know that that's what it's about. Maybe people in the leadership might not even know to the degree that they should. But that the origin and the reason for a group really matters, because then you can track where it's going and why it's making the decisions that it's making, and why it's, othering other people. I mean, they don't use Markabians, but they have the, PTSSPs, and they have the squirrels and all the things, like all the names for the others.
Degraded beings.
Right. And which, when you're on the outside of it and you look at it, you think, oh, that's so childish. But on the inside, you can see that it is that we are going to lower humans to a lower than human vision, so that then, like on the tone scale, they can be lower than rats and then exterminated like rats. Even though I had pet rats growing up, so I wouldn't think about doing that, but still, very smart animals, actually.
I have a friend who keeps them and loves them.
They're very sweet. Anyway, but I think just that idea that a whole group can be started with this leaning towards the annihilation of everyone else, and also still get tax-exempt status, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it shows how much we are in the dark about what a group is really about. And that even people in it are kept in the dark, which is really unconscionable. But I think if they knew, they wouldn't get involved for most things. I've often said, if someone gave you an honest website on it used to be honest brochure, but now website that said what you were going to be doing and needing to give up, and what kind of shape you would be in after you left, and what the real intention is for you and for the rest of the world, that it would be very hard to get membership, except for people who are quite desperate or sociopathic themselves. So,
hey, would you like to be enslaved?
Right, or enslave others? Those are the only two choices, right? So it's very interesting, and that's why it's so important for you to be shedding light on what's remained in the dark.
Yeah, and you're so right that as we look at these groups, and you and I have looked at probably hundreds over the years, because we've been doing this for far too long, that again and again you find that the leader was an ill person, a sick person, physically mentally and sexually often.
Mm-hmm.
And it always had to be kept secret. So, Steve Hassan, with his influence continuum, the idea that the closer to the leader you are, the more you're going to have to conceal about the way the leader behaves. So, I've talked with Janice. I had the great pleasure of meeting Spanky 10 years ago now in Toronto. She came to a conference that we gave. And Hannah Whitfield. I've known Hannah for a very long time. We first met in '86, in fact, in LA. And I've interviewed so many people who worked with Hubbard, and it interests me the way that we sort of have an ideal construction. That it's like when you talk to somebody on the phone, and you talk for them, a number of times, and then you meet them for the first time, and they don't look the way you thought they'd look, even though you hadn't thought how they'd look.
Right, yeah.
And so with the leader of the group, that we make this kind of idealized portrait of them, and that's who they are. And we then try and clone ourselves upon that idealized portrait, which is quite an interesting process. So when I found out about Hubbard's screaming fits, what he called severe reality adjustments, where he would push himself up a few inches away from somebody and scream his head off at them, which must have been deeply unpleasant because he had rotten teeth, so it will have stunk. And he'd be spitting on them and telling them they were suppressive and they were degraded and they were trying to destroy everything in the universe and all of this stuff. And he would completely deflate somebody. I think the first L. Ron Hubbard story I heard as a member that really bothered me. It's a guy called Peter Warren, and I'd been involved for 6 or 7 years, but I hadn't done any of the secret nonsense, the OT level, so called. So I went to this thing, and this guy Peter Warren was coming down. This was a guy who'd worked with Ron, and he was going to give us this talk. And he said, when I arrived at the ship, the first day, I upset somebody, and they put me over the side of the ship on a plank, on 2 ropes, to paint the side of the ship. I'm kind of going, that sounds a bit dangerous. So, okay. And it started getting dark, and I'm painting the side of the ship. And you've got to get some idea of the scale of this thing. The lower deck, I think, was 25 feet high. It's big. And he's there doing this. And this voice comes from above. And he realizes it's Hubbard. And he's never met Hubbard. And he's really excited. It's Hubbard. And Hubbard says, "What are you doing down there, mister?" And he says, "I'm painting the side of the ship." And you're waiting for Hubbard to say, "He hasn't got a safety harness. Bring him up. This is terrible." But no, what Hubbard says is put some lights on so he can see what he's doing.
Oh, wow.
And that was an early moment of concern. Then in the last year I was involved, I hired a guy who had been the commanding officer of St. Hill. So he'd had like 200 people in sailor suits working for him. He was famous throughout the world of Scientology. He was this lovely, lovely man. And I hired him. I was running this little artists agency, and he came along. And one day, my partner at the time, who would later become my first wife and mother of my first 2 children, she hadn't sold a painting that week. And he took her into this tiny little 9x6 room, what we call a box room in the UK, and screamed his head off at her. "You're trying to destroy John. You're trying to ruin everything." And I just hovered outside the door. I didn't know what to do. And the next time I saw him, which was 3 days later, I said to him, where is it written that you do that? Because in Scientology, if it isn't written, it isn't true. And he said, "It's not written anywhere." I said, "Well, why on earth did you do it then?" And he put his head in his hands and he cried. And he said, "Because Hubbard did it to us."
Oh, wow.
And I would later interview just one person after another who'd had a severe reality adjustment. And for me, that kind of ideal portrait, for me, this would be somebody who was calm,
Mm-hmm.
The perfect human being for me is somebody who can deal with anything serenely. And the idea that he's actually sorting these people out. You go, no, he's traumatizing them.
Mm-hmm.
This guy who developed the science of Dianetics to undo trauma is traumatizing people. And of course, he was chucking them overboard from 25 feet or 40 feet up into human sewage in Corfu Harbour, overboarding, tie your ankles together, put a blindfold on you, chuck you into human sewage. And this was part of this great savior, this person who was going to clear the planet, who was going to bring us all back. So, and for me, I mean, in Scientology, in every course room, you have a copy of Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll because it's used in the training routines. And you'll also find a copy of Through the Looking Glass because people get confused and think they're the same thing. They aren't. They're both brilliant, but Through the Looking Glass is one of the greatest things ever written. But that idea of going through the looking glass, that's what Scientology and just about any other authoritarian cult is. It's Janus-faced, it's two-faced. You're told this is going to liberate you, this is going to give you powers, and in fact, it enslaves you. And the enslavement is, as we both know, psychological. So the person actually believes that it's to their benefit, having been made compliant to the reality interpretation of another human being, that they see everything through other eyes, through Ron Hubbard's eyes. For me, the great thing on leaving Scientology, I had a really wonderful and elated year after I left, because I'd been a true believer. I was never on staff, so I never had the humiliation and abuse. I'm the only person I know, and I've met more than 1,000 Scientologists. I'm the only person I know who was never humiliated or abused. It's an aspect of what happens to people in Scientology. There may be celebrities that it didn't happen to, but otherwise, it didn't happen to me. So I came away as a true believer. I wasn't traumatized. There was no trauma bonding or anything like that going on. But I no longer had to conform my thinking to L. Ron Hubbard. I could decide what I wanted to think about anything and everything, which was a real liberation because, of course, we were all brought up in some kind of system, one way or another, with some set of thoughts. So at the age of 28, to be able to go, no, I'll make my own mind up and decide, whether Nietzsche or Lao Tzu or whoever was right about this. And I don't have to swallow anything whole. I don't have to, these are the rules and you've got to follow them anymore. So,
right. It's so interesting as you're talking. I mean, you get these messages over and over again about how L. Ron Hubbard did not care about the individuals in the group, but cared about how they could further the goals of the group. It's a perfect example of him seeing someone who was so devoted. I could only imagine what it did to his psyche to suddenly be on the side of a ship on a plank, needing to paint a boat, that L. Ron Hubbard cared about him having lights, not for his own safety, but so that he could see what he was doing, so he could do a good job painting the ship. And he didn't care about him having any kind of life jacket, or that it was nighttime and that it was time to sleep and he must be tired. None of that comes into play, but just how do I offer not what he needs, but what we need so that he can continue working for us. And so a lot of people, I think, in these situations feel chosen, they feel important, but they are part of this well-oiled machine. And that is quite devastating to find out, once you leave, or that it's the thing that opens your eyes while you're there. And I think also this whole thing about the reactive mind. I mean, when someone's tantruming in your face, I think they're being highly reactive. And, more so than anyone else there, except the people you've trained to treat others that way. But if that's not reactive, I don't know what is actually,
Yeah, I mean, certainly in my study of Scientology, which is I've spent far too much time doing, that one of the things that became clear in looking at the history of Scientology, and of course, let's sell these people a piece of blue sky.
Right.
To this day, remains the only comprehensive history of the movement. That there's the kind of abridged form of it, plus errors, written by Janet Reitman, called Inside Scientology. And I'm sad to say, and it's not plagiarism, because she does credit me in the reference notes. Didn't give me any money. But there's an error per page through the book, sadly. She even gets his date of death wrong at one point. She puts 1985 instead of 86. But otherwise, and it bothers me, there should be PhD students digging into this material, and they aren't. There was Roy Wallace, a sociologist who did his PhD in the 70s and wrote a book called The Road to Total Freedom, which is a misquotation. It's actually The Bridge to Total Freedom and The Road to Freedom. But it's an exceptional book. But he told me, I talked to everybody I could find, and I found him. And he told me that, in fact, he'd run out of money at 1953. So his history of Scientology is just the first 3 years. He was a PhD student funding his own studies and made this exceptional book about it. In digging into that history and, pre-internet, all the libraries I had to get to, all of the people I had to interview, in the end, 150 people's stories are told in the book. Some of it from testimony, some of it from letters, some of it from books, much of it from interviews I did. And it struck me that the history of Scientology was a history of reactivity. Something would happen and Hubbard would react to it. And, so when the New Jersey Medical Association in 1951 filed a suit against the Hubbard Dianetic Research Foundations for practicing medicine without a license, for making promises of medical cure, which they most certainly were doing. I mean, Hubbard was saying could cure asthma, and the dead. You could cure leukemia, you could cure cancer. There were all of these claims going. So he's sued by that, and the reaction is to very quickly sell all of his rights to Dianetics to a man called Don Purcell, who was willing to cover for him,
right?
And say, "I'll take the flak." And so he sold everything to Purcell. Purcell then managed to settle everything. He managed to settle the bankruptcies of the 5 first organizations. Hubbard had bled all of the money out of them into his own pocket. So he managed to settle those bankruptcies, and for $800, he bought everything back from the bankruptcy court. Hubbard, by this time, has fallen out with Purcell because Purcell doesn't want this idea of reincarnation, past lives bringing in. And Hubbard's had an argument with him and stomps off to Phoenix, Arizona, and realizes that he doesn't have a subject anymore.
Yeah.
Because he's sold it for $1, including the rest of his books, to a guy who absolutely bore him no ill will. Along the way, he's had his business manager, a man called James Elliott, steal the mailing lists of Don Purcell's Wichita, Kansas Foundation. We know this because Hubbard wrote 31 letters to that mailing list, and they're funny letters. They are not the Ron Hubbard that people know. So this whinging, whiny guy going on about how he's been tricked and trapped and all of this stuff. And he's in Phoenix, Arizona, and the reaction is, I've got to come up with a new subject. He's down to almost nothing because Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health in 1950 sold 150,000 copies, which by publishers' estimation, 2.5 readers per book. That's a lot of books. That's 375,000 readers that you're looking at. It had been a craze. It started in May and it ended in August, because then he went to the Shrine Auditorium and put this woman, Sonia Bianca, not her real name, on the stage. She was a physics graduate who had a perfect memory now because she was a Dianetic clear, and she couldn't remember any of the formulae from her physics books. And when some wag had Hubbard turn his back and said, "What colour's his necktie?" she didn't know with her perfect photographic memory. So it started coming apart there. By early 52, he's got a few hundred followers left, and he's got to come up with something new. And the reaction is he picks up an Aleister Crowley book, Magic in Theory and Practice. It took a little work to get there, but that's what it was. Grabs these ideas and creates Scientology. You mix science fiction or science fantasy. There was nothing particularly scientific about his fiction, with ritual magic, and you end up with Scientology. And that first year of Scientology, almost everything that he would later come to, it can be found in that first year. By the end of the year, it's deteriorated to the point where he gives what is called the Philadelphia Doctorate course. So you could get a doctorate by listening to Ron Hubbard for 6 weeks. So much easier than the real way of doing it. And there were only 38 people on that course. And that was the whole core following from, having 375,000 readers in 1950. Within 2 years,
Incredible.
He was down to next to nothing. And again, he's reacting. He's always, this comes up, so he comes up with this. And one of those reactions, there was a guy who left Scientology, a guy called Althea Hart. There's a book called Scientology 8.80. I don't know if David Miscavige has taken it out now, but it used to be dedicated to Althea Hart. Althea Hart was his editor. The only book that Hubbard actually wrote was Dianetics and Modern Science of Mental Health. The other 27 books were all written by editors. From Science of Survival, the next book, which was written by Richard DeMille, son of Cecil B. DeMille. You go on, Althea Hart leaves, and he starts this magazine called The Abbey, which is some wonderful person has put it online. And this is where all of the people who are leaving Scientology go to, right into the mid-60s. So Don Purcell writes there. And they have this very friendly community of people who make awful jokes about Ron Hubbard. They're not very impressed with Ron Hubbard. But Althea Hart, in one of these issues, there's a little article called This Is It. And he says Ron Hubbard should date his exclamations. That every 6 months, when he realizes that it doesn't work, and he brings out a new technique, he should say, this is it, June 1957. And as you go back through the history of Scientology, this is absolutely true. He came up with all sorts of ideas like black and white processing in the early 50s, or the rock, from which we get the rock slam, which is misunderstood for all Scientologists. None of them know what the rock is anymore. They just know that there's this banging about of a needle on their e-meter that's called the rock slam. So the rock that was the solution to everything. The service facsimile, that was the solution to everything. And then, of course, so he reacts. He brings up, he says, oh, that doesn't work. There's even in Science of Survival in 1951, he cancels the original technique, the book 1 technique of Dianetics, the book they continued to sell. Jefferson Hawkins managed to get back on the New York Times bestseller lists in the 1990s. He cancelled the technique in it because he said it's hypnotic. And yet it's still used.
Right.
And there are all of these contradictions, all of this bouncing around, all of these reactions. And of course, the final one in the early 60s was to say, no, we'll bring back everything I've ever done that failed, and we'll make a bridge out of it so you can do it all. And by the end, you'll be so confused and you won't have any money left. And I will control your mind. And
it is, I wish more people studied this and exposed it like you have, because there are things that are, of course, very hidden, and there are other things that are so public that L. Ron Hubbard didn't hide. And his whole bridge to total freedom with this cassette, I may have talked to you about, that I got from my father actually a long time ago, where it's L. Ron Hubbard's voice recording about how if you want to enslave people, you need to promise them total freedom. And then there was the bridge to total freedom. And it's right there, like, here, I'm going to let you know what I'm up to, what I'm doing. But then I'm going to build kind of a moat around me that's going to be filled with crocodiles, alligators, and other things. And in that is going to be that you are going to be taught that if you have that aha moment, there's something wrong with you, and that it's bad for the planet, that you're questioning it. But I think a lot of people had those aha moments where they say, well, he really did not hide that he really wanted to enslave, because if you give people total freedom, you can enslave them, which is a very interesting premise, and then built this bridge to total freedom. And it's when you see it like that, you can see what he was up to, and that he was just so he had so much hubris about it that he could just sort of say it out loud. And then this other piece that's about, when we were talking about him being reactive, when you have something that is, I think, a tenet of a group, but it only applies to everybody else, then I think what here, like L. Ron Hubbard is saying, is I want to be able to do and say whatever I want, whenever I want, in any manner I want, but you can't react to it. I don't want to deal with your reaction. I'm not interested in what you have to say about what I just had to say. And especially if you're going to have any kind of negative reaction, I am offering you something that you can't get anywhere else. So I'm going to get a case of the how dare yous. And I don't, want us to go in that direction. So let me just make you feel absolutely wrong and weak for having any reaction to me. Because if I were to come out and say that I think it's bad that people have a reactive mind, or that it's that the root of so much that's bad in the world, I would also assume it's going to apply to me. But that never quite happens in cultic groups, but here certainly not. And it's just something I want people to be aware of, that if there's something that's so strongly rooted in the basic tenet of a group, but only applies to everyone else, the leader is saying, I just don't want you to use it on me. I can't handle it. My ego can't handle it. I don't want to have to deal with your feelings.
Yeah, and this has a very broad application. I was shocked when I found out that Sigmund Freud didn't have a single minute of psychoanalysis.
Huh. Okay.
He didn't think it meant anything to him. And I do view him as the great cult leader of his time. His influence was immense and remains very powerful.
Sure.
But there are all of those same kind of contradictions. Frederick Krueser's book about him is excellent in just going, you're kidding me. Many a long year ago, I wrote a little book called The Total Freedom Trap. And I was struck by exactly what your father was struck by. And here are two quotations from Ron Hubbard to show the looking glass, two-faced nature of this. The first is, Scientology is a religious philosophy in its highest meaning, as it brings man to total freedom. That's L. Ron Hubbard, from an issue called Religious Philosophy and Religious Practice of the 21st of June, 1960, which, for anybody who's pedantic, was revised on the 18th of April, 1967. So Scientology is a religious philosophy in its highest meaning, as it brings man to total freedom. Right. This, I think, is probably what your father sent to you. This is from, again, L. Ron Hubbard, from The Reason Why, the 15th of May, 1956. An endless freedom from is a perfect trap, a fear of all things. Fixed on too many barriers, man yearns to be free, but launched into total freedom, he is purposeless and miserable. So you take your choice, don't you? You're going to be completely free, and you'll be purposeless and miserable.
Wow. Okay. And so if you're purposeless and miserable, then what? Then the answer is Scientology, but it's not if it's for total freedom.
Well, that's what made you purposeless and miserable. That's what gave you the total freedom in the first place. And another aspect of this, which is, I think, supremely important, is the idea that it doesn't matter how supernaturally competent you become, how godlike you become, you will never be able to discover the liberating technology of Scientology. The only person who ever discovered anything was Ron Hubbard. And he makes this very clear in about 1964. There's an early edition of what's called the Auditor magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And he's making an award to somebody for having made a contribution to the technology. And along the side, he says, but of course, it's mine now. All of the major discoveries were mine. And you go back to his earlier books where he's got these long lists of people that he credits as the sources of his ideas. For example, the cycle of action, which is thought to be a major thing in Scientology. Things begin, they change, they stop. Wow, there's a discovery. But he credits that to the Vedic literature.
Yeah.
But later on, he says, no, there were no discoveries. And there's even in Fundamentals of Thought this astonishing claim that in 50,000 years, he's the first person to have found out anything significant. And I'm kind of going, so what was it that was found out 50,000 years ago? You know, if we're going to make America great again, when was it great before?
Mm-hmm.
Which, by the way, Donald Trump did tell us a few weeks ago, it was in the 1890s.
Oh, 1890s.
During which time, of course, the president was shot dead. But the Gilded Age, the age of the great capitalists, when working men did a 12-hour day, 6 days a week, that's when America was last great. I've been asking that question since 2015, and it was great to have an answer finally.
So it's good to have an answer, no matter how wrong it is. And I think, that is actually true, just in terms of psychology and social psychology. Yeah, I mean, people even talk online about where people say, the good old days, whatever that is to people. And they'll go back to, even in their own lifetime, oh, I wish it were back in 1950s, 60s, 70s. And then usually there's a retort of, oh, during that time when there were, whites only drinking fountains and, women have zero rights, couldn't open a bank account and couldn't get a divorce and could, yeah, sure, let's go back there. But I think we all have a different perspective of what good means to us, and what we focus on. It doesn't surprise me that idea of 1890 would be based upon commerce, business, etc., not, social needs and structure and rights. Yeah, I wish I were surprised by that, but I am not. Thanks again to Jon for joining us for what will actually be the first in a series of regular conversations with him. You'll get to hear part 2 of our conversation in a couple of months. And we plan on continuing these regular discussions about once every 2 months to see what Jon has been researching, as he always, and I mean always, has something fascinating up his sleeve to discuss. If you don't want to wait to hear the second half of today's conversation, you can hear and watch it now by becoming a member of the show at patreon.com/indoctrination for as little as $5 a month, where you will also gain access to more than 60 bonus episodes, exclusive merchandise, and more. Thanks to all of our supporters for helping to make conversations like these possible. And now, one more thing before you go. It is fascinating to talk to Jon Atack. I love when he gives us a chance to get some insight into what's going on in his mind, but also the things that he is researching, the things that he's finding out about. And also what I really appreciate about discussing things with him is that he sees things as connected. What is the connection? What's the history? What has led into this next phase of a certain belief system? And where did that come from? And I think that's why it's so important for people to have a sense of history, not only history of the world, but history of organizations, the history of a particular leader and what causes them to do what they do. There's also so much magical thinking that is infused in these groups, and the leaders love to also have a sense of their own magic and their own abilities to bring something special to your life that no one else can. And I think some of their magical thinking is their own idea of specialness. I'm reminded of something actually that one of my kids shared with me, because they know that I one time went to something where I could get continuing education credit that I've talked a little bit about on the podcast, where someone was doing past life regression and you could find out who you were in a past life. And there are many people who believe in that, many people who believe in rebirthing, even though sometimes when people are involved in that, it can actually be very dangerous physically, depending on how it's done. So it's something to be cautious about. But what I found so interesting was the people who were brought into the room as evidence of past lives and being able to do regression into realizing who you were in a past life are very often these people with titles who are very, very special. You're going to meet Buddha, you're going to meet Jesus, you're going to meet Henry VIII. And I remember being at this meeting at a local school and sitting next to a woman who had gone to this particular counselor because she was suffering from neck pain. And I don't know then why she went to a counselor, but I guess she wanted to start there before seeing a doctor. And she was sitting next to me, and I still remember her wearing this huge white scarf that she had tied around her neck, and then it had sort of draped down and fallen down, and she flung it over her shoulder and hit me right in the face. And she did not apologize. And I thought, she must think she is someone very special or reincarnated from someone very special. And so the teacher then pointed at her and said, "I would like to introduce you to Marie Antoinette." And she stood up, and I wanted to say to her, "Are you sure? Sure you want to be Marie Antoinette?" Because we know how that story ends. But it was the way to explain her neck pain, because I believe she died by guillotine. So I don't mind if people believe that they were or are Marie Antoinette. What I do mind is that she still had neck pain, that she was, I think, being dissuaded from going to a doctor to find out if there was something skeletal, something in her neck, in her upper spine, something that she could fix. But instead, this way of treating her helped her develop a story around it. Not relief, though, but just a story. And one of my kids who was reading a book by a historian said that this author had noticed that people who are experiencing these past life regressions and thinking they were these other things in a past life are usually saying that they were someone very special, but that, statistically speaking, if you're looking at history, you have a much higher chance of being the following things. And the list was this: that through statistical probability, you would have been a farmer, or maybe a farmer, possibly a farmer, and most likely a farmer. So I loved that list. It was very real and probably very true. And so what I find that is so heady about so many of these leaders is their sense of their specialness, their sense of being above all others. And that they also promise that to a lot of people in the group, that you can feel special, that you can feel greater than. But what really happens, though, is that people are really torn down. They're really ultimately made to feel less than. And that also when they leave the group, certainly, they are destroyed reputationally. And they're also made to feel they're now part of the world. And the world is often given terrible names and monikers and things that would make you feel like you are now part of this lowly kind of civilization. There is so much about what happens in these groups that lifts you up and then knocks you down. And I think the whiplash of that is really very difficult. And I think also all unnecessary, all something to, I think, make people feel that they have to clamor, they have to try harder to retain a new status before they're slammed down. It's a very unfair burden to place on people, where they feel like they don't get to just be people and equals and see eye to eye with those around them. It is a very, very kind of intoxicating soup of ideas, and one that is laced with fear, that if you're given a special title, but also told that you could lose it at any time, then it's going to be very hard for you to relax, to rest, to not watch your back, and to not be worried about people spreading lies about you, getting to interfere with your reputation. And I think that's why in groups like Scientology, things like KRs are so toxic, so poisonous. KRs being knowledge reports that you're supposed to write up on people, to give information about things they've done wrong to other people in the group. And in fact, even family members are supposed to write up knowledge reports on each other. Of course, I hope for a day where people don't have to deal with this, because it's all false and it's all based on nothing. And it's all a burden that you're placing on people's shoulders for no reason except that you can and that you know how. Thank you again to Jon. And I look forward to having you all hear part 2 of my conversation with him soon.
Thank you very much for listening. Please support Indoctrination on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @Indoctrination Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.